Welcome to The Debate. When we think of ancient architecture, especially religious architecture, we generally expect stone.
Right. Something unyielding, permanent.
Exactly. You expect something definitive. You walk up to a European cathedral, point at the limestone and say, carved in 1100.
Yeah. The material itself offers a kind of indisputable proof. It provides this really legible, undeniable timeline.
Right. But when you examine early American colonial history, particularly the earthen architecture of the American Southwest, well, that clean timeline just shatters.
It really does. Because we are looking at mud. We're looking at straw. I mean, we're talking about structures born from the earth that are inherently vulnerable to, rain, to erosion, and obviously human conflict.
Yeah, the diagnostic landscape of history becomes incredibly complex, and it's all because the material itself is just so fragile.
Absolutely.
So today we are exploring a really fascinating architectural and historical mystery stemming from that exact fragility. We are examining the central question, is the San Miguel Mission in Santa Fe, New Mexico, truly the oldest church in America?
Right, and this discourse emerges from a really complex web of historical chronicles, tourism records, and geographical atlases, all of them attempting to trace the origins of America's oldest standing Christian structures.
Exactly. It's a topic that forces us to confront the actual mechanics of dating earthen architecture, tracing colonial borders, and, well, the very definition of what it actually means for a building to survive.
It forces us to define our terms with rigorous precision, really, because the word oldest is an absolute.
It is. So, in this discussion, I will be taking the position that the San Miguel Mission validly holds the title of the oldest church in the continental United States. I argue that its continuous foundational footprint and its living institutional history, dating back to 1610, transcend the physical reconstructions it has endured.
And I will be taking the opposing position. I argue that bestowing this title on San Miguel is fundamentally inaccurate. If we look at the historical map, we find older structures in U.S. territories. Plus, structurally, we have to acknowledge the complete and targeted destruction of San Miguel's original 1610 superstructure.
Right, the rebuilding.
Yeah, and regionally, we find older contemporaries right there in New Mexico that just dismantle any definitive claim to supremacy.
Well, let's lay out the core of my perspective first. San Miguel's claim to primacy is really rooted in a profound continuous legacy that begins in 1610. The origin story of this church is incredibly rich.
Tied to the Spanish colonial expansion, right?
Exactly. Deeply tied to the logistics of that expansion. It was constructed primarily by Tlaxcalan Indians. These were Mesoamerican allies of the Spanish who traveled, 1,500 miles north from Mexico, settling in New Mexico around 1598.
Wow, quite the journey.
Yeah, and they settled in a neighborhood across the river from the main Santa Fe Plaza, an area known as the Barrio de Analco. When they built this chapel, it served a very specific cross-cultural congregation. A small group of Spanish soldiers, laborers, and the Tlaxcalan community themselves.
I mean, that is a compelling origin, but that original chapel is not what a visitor sees today.
You are correct that it has suffered damage and required rebuilding. But see, I view these reconstructions not as a loss of authenticity, but as the accumulated marks of a living, breathing historical entity.
A living entity?
Yeah, because adobe architecture, mud mixed with straw and baked in the sun, demands constant community interaction. I mean, if you don't continually plaster an adobe wall with new mud, the rain will literally melt it back into the earth.
Right, it just washes away.
Exactly. The building survives precisely because the congregation kept applying new layers. Over the centuries, the community maintained it. In 1798, the mayor of Santa Fe funded a major structural repair. In 1848, they added a 3-tier bell tower.
Though that eventually collapsed, right?
It did, and it was altered. And then in 1955, preservationists stabilized the structure. My point is, when you walk into San Miguel today, the space you occupy is anchored on the nation's oldest continuous continental congregation site. The spirit and the physical footprint of 1610 are still exactly where they've always been.
I come at it from a different way, though, because a footprint is not a building. If we are applying strict definitional precision to the phrase oldest church in America, we have to start with the word America.
Okay, let's look at geography.
Geographically, the claim that San Miguel is the oldest instantly falls apart if we look at the broader United States. The Cathedral of St. John the Baptist, the San Juan Bautista Cathedral in San Juan, Puerto Rico, was constructed in 1521.
Right, the Puerto Rico exception.
Exactly. It was initially built from wood and straw. Yes, it was destroyed by a hurricane, but the community reconstructed it in solid stone in 1529. That makes it undeniably the oldest church building in the United States and its outlying territories. It predates the very first mud brick iteration of San Miguel by nearly a century.
You are entirely correct about the dates of San Juan Bautista. However, I maintain that separating the contiguous North American landmass from outlying island territories is a necessary and highly valid historical classification. It's not just a technicality.
It feels like you're giving San Miguel a pass on a technicality, though. I mean, if we are asking a superlative question about the nation as a whole, we can't just draw a convenient circle around the lower 48 states to exclude Puerto Rico.
Well, it's about the type of colonial movement.
But it feels like a tourism marketing asterisk designed to protect Santa Fe's claim rather than a rigorous historical classification. Both were Spanish colonial efforts. San Juan Bautista has evolved. It received a neoclassic appearance in the 1850s. It had a major reconstruction in 1917, but its starting line is 1521. Why shouldn't that be the definitive answer?
Because the mechanics of survival in the Caribbean are fundamentally different from the mechanics of survival in the high desert of the American West. When historians track overland colonial expansion, they are tracking a very specific, contiguous geographical narrative.
Sure, but
The settlement of Puerto Rico was driven by maritime access. Ships arrived directly from Spain loaded with resources, tools, and eventually the means to quarry and carve stone. Santa Fe, on the other hand, was the terminus of the Camino Real de Tierra Adentro.
right, the Royal Road.
Exactly. A brutal, 6-month, 1,500-mile overland journey from Mexico City, building a church at the very edge of the known continental empire, relying solely on the dirt beneath your feet, creates a completely different category of architectural survival. By establishing San Miguel as the oldest in the continental U.S., we are honoring a specific overland timeline that is uniquely tied to the North American landmass.
The overland journey is a remarkable feat of human endurance, absolutely. But the logistical difficulty of getting to Santa Fe doesn't change the calendar. Even if I grant you the continental boundary for the sake of argument, we immediately run into the problem of the dirt itself.
The fragility of the adobe.
Yes. This brings us to the structural integrity of San Miguel. You mentioned earlier that adobe must be continuously plastered or it melts. But San Miguel didn't just slowly erode from neglect. It was actively, violently erased.
You are referring to the Pueblo revolt of 1680.
I am, and we need to be precise about what happened. The indigenous Pueblo people didn't just rise up over minor misunderstandings. They were subjected to a brutal system of forced labor by the Spanish colonial government.
It was a horrific period of subjugation, yes.
Right. Franciscan friars violently suppressed their traditional religious practices, raiding kivas and destroying sacred objects. So when the Pueblo warriors coordinated an uprising in 1680, they descended upon Santa Fe and intentionally targeted the churches.
Which makes sense as a military and cultural target.
Exactly. They didn't just damage San Miguel, they burned the superstructure to the ground. They viewed the church as the ultimate symbol of colonial subjugation, and they leveled it. Because they burned the wooden beams and the adobe walls collapsed, the Spanish were driven away for over a decade.
Until the Reconquest, right?
The structure we look at today was built around 1710. So if you are a tourist standing in Santa Fe today, reading the oldest church plaque, you assume you are looking at 17th century walls. You are actually looking at an 18th century reconstruction built over a 17th century foundation.
You are entirely correct about the violence and the cultural mechanism of the Pueblo revolt. The destruction was targeted and absolute. But if we shift our perspective to how preservation actually works, in an environment built of earth,
the 1710 reconstruction doesn't invalidate the building's age.
How so?
It affirms its living lineage. Think of earthen architecture less like an unchanging monument and more like a sourdough starter.
A sourdough starter?
Hear me out. If you have a family sourdough starter from 100 years ago, the actual flour and water in the jar today were added last week. The original physical ingredients are long gone. But the living culture, the microbiological lineage, has survived completely unbroken because it was continuously fed. San Miguel functions the exact same way.
But a building is not a yeast culture. It is an architectural structure consisting of walls, a roof, and an interior space. If the walls and the roof are gone, the building is gone.
I don't think it's that simple with adobe.
But when you look at the thick earthen walls today, or the heavy wooden beams supporting the roof, which are called vigas, none of that wood or mud is from 1610. Even the carved wooden statues of saints on the altar, known as bultos, are much later additions. Claiming the building is from 1610 because the foundation is buried beneath the floorboards conflates the geographical site with the physical structure.
I disagree that it conflates the two, because the physical site holds the specific material history of the people who rebuilt it. Let's look at how the floor itself was made.
Okay.
When you walk into San Miguel, the dirt floor beneath your feet was historically sealed using ox blood.
Wait, literally ox blood?
Literally. The local builders didn't have concrete. They mixed cattle blood with dirt and ash because the albumin, the protein in the blood, acts as a natural polymer. It binds the loose dust into a hard, durable surface that sweeps clean and resists wear.
That's incredibly resourceful.
It is. And that floor, those continuous layers of mud plaster on the walls, they are the feeding of that architectural sourdough starter. If we demand that 17th century original walls must remain standing to qualify, we effectively disqualify nearly all 17th century architecture in the United States.
I don't think that's true. There are colonial structures on the East Coast that haven't been completely leveled.
I see why you think that, but let me give you a different perspective. Let's examine the East Coast, where they had much more durable materials like fired brick. Consider the Jamestown Church in Virginia.
Sure, the famous site.
The site had a wooden church in 1609. Decades later, they built a larger brick structure completed around 1647. But what happened? The economic center of the colony shifted. The capital moved to Williamsburg, the Jamestown Church was abandoned, fell into ruins, and the local population actually scavenged the bricks from the church to build graveyard walls.
Because practical survival outweighed preservation.
Exactly. Practical survival and property borders outweighed preserving a ruined religious structure. The only 17th century material standing above the foundation today is a single brick tower. The present church building was constructed in 1906.
Jamestown is an excellent example, but it actually proves my point. Historians and tour guides at Jamestown do not claim the 1906 Memorial Church is the original 1609 structure. They clearly delineate between the site of the ancient congregation and the modern building standing upon it.
My point is that architectural survival over 400 years is never a static phenomenon. Another example is Old Trinity Church in Maryland, built of brick in 1675. Over the centuries, it was radically remodeled.
In what way?
In the 1850s, the congregation wanted a Gothic look, so they added pointed arches and sealed off the original windows. 100 years later, in the 1950s, preservationists had to undertake massive restorations just to strip away the Gothic additions and return it to its 17th century appearance.
Right, a common preservation story.
So if a brick church on the East Coast requires a 1950s architectural intervention to maintain its historical identity, why do we penalize San Miguel for a 1710 rebuild of its mud walls? The congregation's continuous institutional presence in Santa Fe, rebuilding the walls, reapplying the ox blood, sourcing new vigas from the mountains, makes it the same historical entity.
The difference is that Old Trinity Church still has its 1675 brick walls holding up the roof, even if the windows were moved. San Miguel's 1610 walls were returned to dust. But let's follow your logic for a moment.
Okay.
Let's say I accept your sourdough framework. Let's say foundational continuity and institutional survival are enough to claim the title of oldest church. Even under those deeply generous parameters, San Miguel still might not be the oldest church in the region, which brings us to the actual documentary evidence in New Mexico.
You are pointing to the ambiguity of the written dating.
I am pointing to the complete lack of definitive early records. The written chronicles from early New Mexico are incredibly slim. The irony of the Pueblo revolt is that while it necessitated the rebuilding of the churches, the warriors also burned the colonial archives in Santa Fe,
leaving us with very few contemporary documents. Right, San Miguel is thought to have been built in 1610, largely based on circumstantial context and local tradition. But the absolute oldest written confirmation we have of its existence is a document from 1629. We are making a 19-year assumption.
It's an educated assumption based on settlement patterns.
Sure, but that assumption becomes highly problematic when we examine the actions of the Franciscan missionary priests outside of Santa Fe.
You mean how the Franciscans were establishing dozens of far-flung missions throughout the various pueblos along the Rio Grande?
Exactly. And one of those missions was St. Augustine Church at Isleta, Pueblo, south of modern-day Albuquerque. St. Augustine is widely thought by historians and the local parish to have been built in 1609.
Which would make it a year older, right? If that 1609 date is accurate, St. Augustine automatically usurps San Miguel's title as the oldest in the continental United States, beating it by at least a year, and potentially 20 years if we rely strictly on San Miguel's 1629 written record.
That's a fair point.
The burden of proof rests on the entity claiming the superlative. If San Miguel wants to market itself as the definitive oldest, it needs definitive proof. A surviving written record from 1629 simply does not cut it when a neighboring site stakes a credible claim to 1609.
I hear you, but the demand for a 1610 birth certificate is applying a standard of empirical proof that is fundamentally impossible for this specific era and environment. Yes, San Augustine at Isleta Pueblo claims an origin of 1609, but St. Augustine was also heavily damaged in the Pueblo revolt.
Also burned.
Yes, it too had to be rebuilt on its original foundations. The lack of definitive written documentation from before 1629 doesn't invalidate San Miguel's claim. Rather, it places both San Miguel and St. Augustine into a shared category of ancient, continuous spiritual sites whose exact inception dates will forever remain slightly out of focus.
But if they are in a shared category of blurry, circumstantial dates, San Miguel cannot legitimately claim supreme primacy. You cannot definitively say you are the oldest if you are in a statistical tie with your neighbor.
Well, I argue that San Miguel's claim is bolstered by its centrality to the colonial administrative record, which gives us a clearer picture of its continuous function. San Miguel was entangled with the highest levels of provincial government.
In what capacity?
Well, we know it existed long before the Pueblo revolt, because in 1640, the provincial governor Luis de Rojas actively dismantled part of it during a bitter political dispute with the Franciscan friars over authority in Santa Fe.
Ah, political infighting.
Exactly. Its prominence in the capital, its continuous use by the Tlaxcalan descendants, and its survival through the violent ebb and flow of colonial control give it a culturally recognized claim to the title. We don't have the 1610 blueprints, but the preponderance of geographical and political context strongly supports its foundational age as the oldest continuous site.
Leaning on cultural recognition or preponderance of context is risky, though, when that consensus is largely driven by local tradition and modern tourism narratives. Look, I don't deny the profound historical weight of the space.
It is quite heavy when you are standing in there.
Unquestionably, when you stand inside San Miguel, looking up at the heavy wooden vigas, breathing in the scent of aged adobe and pine, you are undeniably experiencing a deep, resonant history. But words matter. Oldest is not a flexible concept.
It can be a nuanced one, though.
But if we accept that the San Miguel superstructure visitors see today dates to 1710, and we accept that St. Augustine has a credible claim to 1609, and we acknowledge that San Juan Bautista in Puerto Rico has physical stone walls standing from 1529, then calling San Miguel the oldest church in America is a definitive statement layered over a profoundly indefinite reality. It demands that we ignore geography, redefine the physics of architecture, and guess at the dates of undocumented mud.
Which brings us to the fundamental core of our disagreement today. As we summarize our positions, I maintain that foundational continuity, institutional survival, and the unique overland geography of the continental United States absolutely validate San Miguel's title. The building is a living process, not a stagnant artifact.
Even without the original walls.
Exactly. From the Tlaxcalan laborers who laid the first earthen bricks, to the community sealing the floors with ox blood, to the 1950s stabilization efforts, the chapel has adapted to survive its environment. It is anchored in the oldest foundational footprint of any continuous continental congregation. The mud may have been reapplied, but the lineage is unbroken.
And my position remains that precise empirical definitions must guide our historical claims. The existence of a much older surviving structure in Puerto Rico, the 1521 San Juan Bautista Cathedral, instantly challenges the national title.
Under a strictly geographic framework, yes.
Furthermore, the targeted destruction of San Miguel superstructure in 1680 means visitors are interacting with an 18th century building. When combined with the fact that San Agustin at Isleta claims an older founding date of 1609, the definitive claim to the title of oldest is thoroughly and comprehensively dismantled.
Yet, despite our conflicting frameworks regarding timelines and titles, I think we arrive at a powerful point of convergence. We both recognize that the history of early American architecture is inherently a story of erosion, of violent cultural collision, and of resilient rebuilding.
Unquestionably, the exact dating of adobe structures is a monumental challenge, precisely because of the fragile physics of earthen materials, and of course, the tragic loss of early written records during the revolts. The history of the Southwest wasn't just forgotten by time. In many cases, it was actively burned and buried.
It is a really compelling realization. The mystery of those missing archives and those buried foundations is exactly what makes historical exploration so vital. It forces us to look past the surface layer of plaster.
It requires us to engage with the material critically. If you are a visitor standing in Santa Fe, you shouldn't just read the bronze plaque by the front door and accept it. You have to ask yourself what exactly you are looking at and what forces shaped it.
Precisely. We encourage everyone listening to look deeper into the surviving architecture of these incredible ancient sites, from the enduring 1521 stones of San Juan Bautista to the oxblood-sealed floors and hand-hewn vigas of San Miguel. There is so much more to explore in the material.
Absolutely. Examine the evidence, weigh the historical logistics of the reconstructions, and form your own conclusion about what truly constitutes an original building.
In the end, when you stand in a space where centuries of humanity have gathered, you have to ask yourself, does a building's age live strictly in its unyielding walls or in the unbroken legacy of the ground it stands on?